I'm recording.
Looks like my audio is working a bit better than last time. I had a problem with my levels being way too low. The mixer itself it's not showing the levels. It usually, the green lights light up to show the levels, but it's just not. Phantom power for the microphone. I don't know if it needs it or something. It's on at the moment. I just hope it doesn't fry the microphone.
So that rainbow color coordinated shelf, does that orange not look green to you?
Which orange?
You have the color blindness with like the orange and green or something like that?
No, I mean colors like that. They look how you see them. They're pungent enough. Yeah. But seriously, rainbow organizing your shelf is so good. It just looks so much better. It's uncanny. Okay. I was thinking, why don't we do an episode where we swap accents?
That sounds like, I don't know.
I'll probably cause you massive offense with my rendition of an American accent.
You probably will.
We could do it just for the intro.
We could probably do a British accent like, hello, my name is Oscar Archibald.
That's perfect. Okay. Shall we start? Hello, listeners, and welcome to Fighting Failure, the podcast where we talk about solutions to the climate crisis. I'm your host for this episode, Oscar Archibald.
And I'm your co-host, Hisham, Kanaan. Alright, I'm done with this. I'm done switching accents.
It's hard.
It is hard.
Okay, so this episode is all about propaganda and what we think we know is a lie. So,
Yeah, so quick introduction to propaganda, I guess. For those of you who don't know, Oscar, do you want to, define that?
Yeah, so off the top of my head, propaganda, it's sort of like when governments or vested interests advertise to you, rather than trying to sell your product, the advertising is intended to influence the way you think about certain things. So, for example, a common phrase is stuff like communist propaganda, which would be when communism was a thing in the Soviet Union, that they would have certain influencing campaigns to try and get the citizens to align with the views of the state. And the modern incarnation of propaganda is that we have all these oil companies and lots of companies and governments as well with malicious interests that are trying to influence people to think positively of them or to not campaign against them or to think that what they're doing is good. Propaganda can sort of go both ways, I guess. You can have negative propaganda and positive propaganda. A lot of people try to say something like, oh, that's vegan propaganda. It has a term has quite a negative connotation. But, environmental influencing is also a form of propaganda because in a way we're trying to convince you of our viewpoint. However, our viewpoint is a bit more backed by science, I think would be fair to say.
Yeah, so in general, just summary-wise, the difference between propaganda and advertisement is that advertisement, I guess propaganda is a form of advertisement, but in advertisement generally, and in the episode that we've done in the past, advertisement sort of refers to when you're trying to push sales onto someone. So when you're trying to sort of increase the sales of a product, right? It's like it's your promotion. It's all based in consumption, whereas propaganda, like Oscar said, is it's trying to shift your entire mindset, generally to sort of weasel you into a certain political standpoint that then means that you support possibly one party over the other, one representative over the other.
Absolutely. And the forms that it takes are often quite similar, so it's quite difficult to tell the difference. In America, you have a lot of TV advertisements for politicians, and even I've heard of stories the Democrats are funding campaigns for Republicans because they think that those Republicans, if they win the primary, will then lose to their Democrat candidate. So there's a lot of, that's a sort of side tangent, but, stuff like leaflets and billboards, all these sorts of things, these are forms that propaganda can take, junk mail, and those are things that companies use for advertisements as well. The difference is, I guess, trying to convince you of something rather than trying to convince you of a point. It doesn't lead to an immediate sale or something, but it helps them in the long term rather than the short term, I guess. But I think with that, let's move on to the problems that propaganda faces, or that we face as a result of propaganda.
Yeah, so this first point is very similar to a lot of what we talked about in advertisement, which is that oil companies have a massive marketing spend, and they use it to try and sway public opinion. So because of how much money the oil companies have, and because of how much influence they have, because basically the world's economy is reliant on the oil industry, they're able to massively influence politics and the world around us.
Yeah, it's seriously scary. So there's I guess, two main ways in which oil companies use their marketing money. So the first way is the sort of what we see, which is advertising. And at first you might see an ad from an oil company and think, well, that's just an advertisement. They're trying to get me to buy something. But when you think about it, you don't really choose what brand of oil you buy, really. So these companies are more just trying to get into your conscience, or a lot of the advertisements these days will be sort of trying to align themselves with the public conscience in general, trying to appear climate positive by campaigning about, look what these positive things we do. So I think once I saw ads from Saudi Aramco, which is once the biggest company in the world or something, in terms of biggest valuation, and that was about how they're using technology to capture carbon on moving trucks, or some absolute rubbish technology that is not going to exist. It's not going to be at scale. It's not going to help anyone, really. The only people it's helping is Aramco, because it makes them look good. And that's the only purpose of a lot of these carbon capture technologies. They're promoted by oil companies because they give them an out. Carbon capture gives oil companies a way to keep producing oil, when we need to just stop producing oil, because that's what's really causing the problem. And so they say, oh, we're funding millions of dollars into these projects. Millions of dollars, it's not a lot of money on this scale in terms of stopping the climate crisis. They're making billions and billions and billions, spending like 0.1% of their revenue on these green technologies is more than enough to balance out all the negative impacts they would have had if people had instead stopped buying oil or stopped producing oil. So that's sort of consumer-facing advertising. I guess the biggest example of consumer-facing advertising in the oil industry is the invention of the carbon footprint. We talked about this before in an episode about the climate shadow, was how BP, British Petroleum, it was their advertisements, their marketing agency invented the term carbon footprint because it was the most genius idea of the decade. It turned what was oil companies having the blame for carbon emissions instead of them, into consumers having the blame because it's their carbon footprint. It's seriously evil genius move. And so the other side of the coin is then what we don't see, but what affects us probably more is lobbying. So I'm not intimately familiar with how lobbying works, but from what I understand, it's sort of schmooze and booze. You get the oil company executives or their lobbyists who get paid ridiculous amounts of money, and then they go and they meet with the government, and maybe there's some money exchanged or some sort of gifts. It's very dodgy. It's almost like bribery, but at very high levels, it's a way that, with a very high success rate, companies with vested interests can make lawmakers, in Congress or houses of parliament or whatever, agree with them and vote for what they want. So there have been so many well-meaning bills proposed by governments that have been shot down by the dairy industry lobby or the meat industry lobby or the oil lobby or the plastic lobby. It's really ridiculous.
I mean, and one of the problems there is that the oil companies, because of the amount of money that they have and the influence that they have in a lot of our economies, when a politician is running, like a lot of politicians and campaigns are sponsored by oil companies, and so they have a lot of influence in what our governments are and aren't able to do with regards to mitigation, adaptation, etc.
Yeah, Australia actually has a massive problem with this, in that basically both the main parties, Liberal and Labor, are both massively funded by oil industry. Australia has a fairly sizable coal lobby, quite rare in the world these days. Coal's really failing economically, as well as natural gas exploitation. And it's really difficult because Australia, and it's true for the US as well, is such a precious landscape. Places like Alaska or Australia, Aboriginal land as well in Australia is a contentious issue. And then these oil companies, just by paying for the campaign finance or stuff like that, this for these parties, are able to get a massive amount of influence over the decisions that are made. And it's really undemocratic that just because they have a lot of money, that they can then influence the democracy.
And I mean, the most recent sort of discussion that's been going on globally is this, that Biden and the Biden administration just okayed the Willow Project, which is a project to drill in Alaska, I think the quite far north in Alaska, which obviously there's a ton of wildlife threats. I mean, if there's an oil spill, if that gets into aquatic systems, it's very easily transferable. And then that's obviously not good because no living thing should be exposed to oil. So, I mean, yeah, there's a ton of problems with that. And I mean the thing is Biden sort of campaigned on, and he's not the he wasn't it wasn't like his main point throughout the campaign, but he did campaign on the fact that he was gonna rejoin COP, he was gonna do XYZ, about the environment, and he created this appeal. Like it's a perfect example of propaganda. He sort of created this appeal that makes it seem to the public like he's like sort of openly available to make change and make the change that people want to see towards a more climate positive future. But then because of the influence of the oil industry and how much the American economy relies on oil and the amount of money that we'd have to spend to shift from oil to renewables, he ended up being the one okaying the Willow Project. I think it's been a concept for quite a while now. And so, I mean, it's a perfect example of propaganda and how that can sort of, and how politicians sort of use that to get into their positions, right?
Yeah, Biden got into office on a partially environmental platform. We were at 2020 when the election was coming around. We were looking at statistics that were saying, the world can't survive 4 more years of Donald Trump environmentally. But I don't think Joe Biden has been that much better. He's been better. I mean, we had the Inflation Reduction Act, a very misnomer, which had a massive amount of money for renewables and stuff, but that money was very protectionist, and now the EU is getting annoyed at that, which is a whole other can of worms. But you get the point that he has reneged on a lot of his promises. I think, I put in the comments if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that there have been promises that he made in his campaign that have been broken outright. Even, it's not just that he's not following the spirit of his campaign. I think there have been individual promises that have been broken. Might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the case.
I mean, yeah. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act is great. And there have been a couple. I mean, he rejoined COP immediately.
Yeah, the Paris Agreement. Of the Inflation Reduction Act is only a sliver of what he wanted to be initially. But that's the Republicans' fault for whittling that down, not the Democrats. It sort of is the Democrats. It's Joe Manchin's
everyone's fault. And you know what? And my opinion on the matter is that until both Democrats and Republicans can work together to form a holistic government, we're not going to get anywhere, because there's always going to be an unequal distribution of power in different levels of government, and then that's going to cause clash. And it's at this point, and I think this is partially because of Donald Trump, but there's so much segregation, and this is sort of a side tangent, but there's so much segregation within the political system now. Like, it's just you're either a Democrat or a Republican. There's no in between, and it's like it's right or wrong, and you're either on one side or the other, and it's created such a divide that there's no way of forming like a rational agreement between the two parties. It's so rare now, like both on a public level and like on a governmental level, for like people to have like rational sort of discussions with one another.
Yeah, it's just been driven to such extremes of partisanship that it's ridiculous. And I'd like to blame the Republicans, but it's not. The Democrats have done bad things as well in that sphere of partisan, like ultimate partisanship, and not working together on anything. It's really interesting if you look at the sort of graphs of over time how much cross-voting there was, how many Democrats voted with the Republicans or against their party. There used to be so much more. It used to be parties were sort of a loose affiliation, and now it's such strict votes. You just have a vote along party lines. And, they have the filibuster rule, which is very much, in my view, it's very much a bad faith thing. It's become a de facto part of how it works, of how the political system works. So you need 60 votes in the Senate rather than 50. But the filibuster, that's really bad faith, because it's basically saying, I will just stand here and talk forever to obstruct democracy. So it's very much a side tangent, but I think it's so difficult to get democracy right, because you have the US where it's unequal on every level, because you have the electoral college and the counties and the partisanship and the two-party system and first past the post and all these issues and bicameral legislature, all these issues add up. But if you have a look at countries like Israel or Italy with a proportional representation system, it's bad in similar ways, because as soon as you don't have a majoritarian system, you have to have parties working together, and it doesn't necessarily, it's not all, roses or whatever. So it's not great, but democracy, that's a side tangent from propaganda. So yeah, let's talk briefly about the tactics that oil companies and all sorts of companies with bad intentions use to influence the public, or propaganda tactics. And I guess by knowing these, it'll help you sort of spot them and avoid them. The first one is like diversion. So instead of looking at their own problems, they'll point at someone else's. So an example of this would be the meat industry. Instead of accepting criticism that, beef has such a bad impact on the environment, which it does. Instead, people will point somewhere else and say, oh, look, almonds, they require a lot of water too. Did you know that? Almonds require a lot of water. And it's totally shifting the blame. The fact that almonds require water have nothing to do with the water requirement of dairy or beef or anything like that. But just, and this is, quite a big problem. And it's not just, meat industry specifically, but media even will do this. Tabloids and such will just point the blame somewhere else, divert the blame, and say it's all almonds and avocados' fault. Nothing to do with animal agriculture at all.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of methods that these companies use. I mean, and going back to the carbon footprint, like that concept of carbon footprint that BP sort of invented. I mean, that's your golden example.
Well, I think I would agree it is a golden example because it just permeates the culture so much. What they have managed to do is they have managed to get their marketing of the carbon footprint basically everywhere within the pro-climate movement. Almost everyone that's advocating for climate is using those two words, carbon footprint. And so I think it worked really well. It's a great example of propaganda.
I mean, by deflecting the blame from, and it's like, I mean, like Oscar said, like the meat industry sort of often they deflect the blame to another industry, often something that would be in high consumption in a vegan or vegetarian diet. But yeah, I mean, you can also have deflection to the sort of public, which is exactly what BP did. And so you end up having people feel like it's all up to us. Like, and you hear this all the time, and it drives me crazy, is people out there like, I'm going to go on a bike ride for today. I'm going to ride my bike like one day a week to work, and I'm going to pick up a plastic bag on the beach, and like I'm doing my part and blah, blah, blah. And it's been shifted onto us in a way that, we continue to use fossil fuels because we feel like we can like sort of repent for our sins by riding a bike one day. So we're like, we'll just drive for the rest of the week. And then B, I mean, all these actions that we have are almost negligible. Like a lot of the stuff we do is practically negligible. I mean, obviously reducing plastic consumption, great, shifting your diet to a primarily vegetarian or vegan diet, that's great. Like shifting away from meat, but like there's a lot of things that we can do individually and as a community. But I mean, a lot of these things that they're like, ride your bike once a week, it's so much better, do X, Y, Z. It's like a lot of that stuff, really, the impact is so minimal, and it makes you feel good enough that you can keep using their products, which are actually really bad. Then the next sort of point that I'd like to add, and I don't know if this is sort of going into advertisement, is greenwashing, which comes into propaganda a lot. By the way, but I'll just use a quick advertisement example here, which is Coca-Cola, who they made, I don't know exactly what the statistic claim that they made was, but it was something like 25% of our bottles are recycled, the plastic ones, or there was something like that. It was something around that, and in reality, they're one of the biggest plastic producers globally, and so, I mean, really recycling, whatever it is, 25% of the plastic in a plastic bottle when you're the number one plastic producer in the world doesn't negate the effect that you're having. It just makes people feel good enough that they're like, well, and so people who don't really have an idea, they can go, well, it's better, so I can buy it without feeling bad about it. And that's what greenwashing is, right? And that's a big thing. I mean, often companies will use the kind of concept of composite materials. And for those who don't know, a composite material is a material that has both paper and plastic in it, or aluminum and plastic. And it's very hard to recycle because to recycle those materials, you have to separate them effectively. Like if there's a sliver of aluminum or plastic on a cardboard package, you can't recycle it. Or if there's organic waste in that. So I think oftentimes companies, they'll go like, they'll make their product, or they'll like shift to like a carton or something like that looks more sustainable. But in reality, the carton is a composite material because it has that waxy sort of feeling on the outside, which is plastic actually. It's a plastic laminate. They have a plastic laminate on the inside, possibly aluminum, possibly some metal, and then they have the little lid which could have aluminum too. So I mean, it's like you can't recycle that at that point. It just looks recyclable, so people immediately feel like they can buy that. And that's something that a lot of like government does very often. I don't know if Oscar, you want to talk about this, but I mean, government does this a lot, where they'll sort of make themselves look sort of green and climate friendly and blah blah blah, but in reality that's not, it's not that clear, you know, like the lines aren't that defined, there's no black and white, like it's not that simple really.
Yeah, governments are a great example of the next tactic, which is setting targets rather than climate action, which is saying stuff like net zero by 2050, which most countries, I would say, have some sort of target or plan to make some sort of target.
Malawi's target is like some, I mean, obviously Malawi is a developing country, and so obviously the goal is to develop. Great, it's a great idea. However, if there's now these like billboards all around town where it's like Malawi's goal 2063 or something like that, and it's a big picture of like them using like spraying pesticides on their crops and like a picture of like skyscrapers, and it's like, that's not what we want, you know, like it looks like, you know, whatever you might want to think, like it looks like this typical US from like 20-30 years ago when everyone was like, wow, and like, okay, you can, but like that's not the direction that we need to be going in. And it's like, I don't know, I mean, I don't know how we go about that, because it's hard to say, like, you know, at the point at which like all these developed nations have been like, they've gone through an industrial revolution, it's not been a green one, and they've effectively made it to the point which they're at. It's like it's a risk to tell a developing nation to shift the format in which they develop. So then that also sort of bleeds into the way that we're developing in Malawi and the vision that we have for the future. But like Oscar was saying, yeah, there's a lot of countries where their like goal for 2050 is to do blah blah blah. And Oscar, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, so net zero by 2050 targets are very common, or net zero by 2060, or some have lots of different targets earlier. But all these targets are just that. They are targets and they're not climate action. If you pass a law saying you're going to be net zero by 2050, most countries that do that are then not actually passing the laws that actually fulfill that promise. And they're just, you know, kicking the can down the road and waiting for someone else to come along, some different prime minister. It's the thing with short terms, you know, different prime minister or different president to come in and actually take action, or a different Congress. And so they get the kudos by setting these targets, but they don't actually have to do any of the work. And so many different brands and companies do the same thing. They have all this marketing, and, you know, graphic design is a really powerful tool. They have so much marketing. Governments do it too. They have good graphic design sometimes. And they have all this marketing about how we're going to be net zero, and it makes you feel good. And it's like, oh, this is a good company. They're doing this. That's greenwashing. But if they're just setting targets and they're not actually doing anything to achieve those targets, you know, and then, you know, maybe the date comes around, 2050 rolls around, and they'll just silently repeal the law, or, you know, the brand will just remove the marketing because they got the kudos from the marketing and they didn't have to do any work for it, and they can just take it away. You know, there's no accountability. That they don't have to report that they are, if they're getting next to net zero or something. It's terrible. The next tactic I already really talked about, which was funding climate projects, even though a minuscule amount of money is actually spent, so I'll skip over that for now. And yeah, carbon capture and storage, it's so bad. And governments are in on it too, sort of this rosy idea of that we can have carbon capture and that will solve the problems, that will make up for us still being able to use some fossil fuels. It's just it's making promises now, or emitting carbon now, that we think we'll get rid of later using technology that doesn't even exist.
It's a very technocentric, and it's a very cornucopian standpoint. I mean, it's the sort of idea that whatever situation we're in, we'll have a way to get out of it and a way to expand our carrying capacity because we're humans and we're invincible. And that's sort of the thing, is like, I mean, a lot of governments, they try and follow this sort of like technocentric viewpoint where they're like, we'll use tech to like offset our blah blah blah, or we'll like offset our carbon emissions by paying for a piece of land in whatever random developing country to offset our, like, there's ways that they have, but often it's technology based, and it's technology, like Oscar said, that doesn't exist yet, and they're saying, you know, at some point in the future, like, it's not going to be a problem, so let's just keep emitting now, and, you know, whatever, no biggie. And then at some point in the future, God knows when, there'll be some sort of technology that can save us all, and that's that. And it's like this sort of idea that we can get out of anything, and it looks good, because it makes it sound like they're in the process of developing the technology, and it makes it sound like they're going to actively use the technology, and it makes it sound like the technology is going to be here soon. But in reality, it's not. That's not always the case, right?
Just seriously, the amount of news I see about small, tiny pilot direct air capture projects, in Iceland that's storing away CO2 or something like that, compared to news like about stopping oil or anything like that, it feels like the media are also not really portraying an accurate picture of what's happening. And there's so much techno-optimism that we can science our way out of the climate crisis. But science has been warning us about this for 50 years, something like that. And we haven't paid heed yet. And so the actual science, the actual legitimate science, the current science is telling us what we need to do, and we're not doing that. So it's really dumb and annoying.
I mean, that's it, simply put. And again, like these oil companies, in the same way that they have control over the government, and same with the plastic companies, or not plastic companies, but yeah, plastic companies essentially, and the meat industry, right? They all have this sort of hold over news, and sometimes indirectly through politics, like through their sort of ability to manipulate politics, they have some hold on the news companies, and this enables them to sort of to greenwash in very discreet ways, and to put out these ideas that, like, they're not quite right, but they sound right to the sort of untrained eye, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the news companies are a really interesting thing. But the next two industries we can talk about probably, hopefully, fairly quickly. We've talked about some of this stuff before. Plastic companies. Plastic is really annoying because it's really useful. It's a really good material. It works really well for what we use it for, and it's essentially irreplaceable in a lot of its applications. But the plastic companies have done a lot of marketing and lobbying to sort of keep it that way and make it that we don't really have a choice. Because I think we should at least be offered a choice if we want to use plastic or paper or metal or anything else other than plastic, or just not buy like random plastic crap anyway. We've already done an episode about why plastic recycling is a scam, I think, which was a great episode, and there's lots of great YouTube videos about the same topic, which is that essentially the long and short of it is that plastic companies invented plastic recycling, and as a way to improve public conscience about it. There's a famous advertisement that was paid for by plastic recycling, and it was saying, don't litter America, pick up your trash. And so they're trying to, same as oil companies, are trying to make it look like they're the good guys, they're on the side of the planet, when actually they're just trying to make you feel good about plastic. A, make you feel good about plastic because, it's all recyclable, and B, make you put the blame on you. You're the ones littering. It's not our fault for making so much disposable plastic. They made this advertisement. There was a Native American dude in like a canoe, like one of those wooden canoes, canoeing down a river, and it was full of plastic. He was an Italian actor. Like, seriously. Anyway, yeah, so many products are plastic with no alternative that if you want to buy almost anything, you have to have plastic. And if you're going to order your, groceries online, then everything comes in plastic. Even if you ask no plastic, it just still all comes in plastic. It's really difficult.
And like I said, I mean, even when it looks like it doesn't come in plastic, often it's a marketing ploy for it to that actually it does involve plastic, because it's a composite material, like I said, and it looks like cardboard or it looks like paper, but it has that waxy laminate that makes it completely unrecyclable, non-biodegradable. I mean, it's so hard to it's impossible to avoid it. I can point out well over 100 plastic objects in my room right now. I mean, it's impossible, and they have such a hold on us.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, the problem with plastic is not so much landfill. Like, not in developing nations, but in countries like America and the UK, if you put something in your landfill bin, it should be disposed of fairly responsibly. That we have ways that landfill sites can sort of be contained, and once they're done with, converted into a golf course or something. the issue is more the impact of the production, the transportation, the excessive consumerism. What stuff does get littered is a real problem. Microplastics, all that sort of stuff degrading off. That's a real problem. And so they're harnessing all this stuff about making it look like it's recyclable or something, when that's not even the biggest issue, because plastic's never recyclable. Even if you could get all the recyclable plastic to a recycling facility, even then it can't really be recycled. So plastic recycling is totally a lie, and anything that's trying to make it look like it's recyclable, that's because that's the only credential that they have, and that they're just lying, really.
I think disposal is a big problem, and even in developed countries, disposal is a big problem because sometimes location's not wisely selected, so you'll have plastic making its way into river systems that might make their way into lakes or into the ocean. So I mean, obviously there's that. There's a lot of developing countries, and sort of like the BRIC countries, you'll have a lot of poorly disposed of waste. And the US, you'll have a lot of poorly disposed of waste that ends up in the ocean.
Yeah, I think contamination of recycling bins is a big issue. So if companies are making stuff look like or feel like it's recyclable, then people are putting, like a dirty, greasy pizza box that can't be recycled because it's got organic matter in it, and that's contaminating the recycling bin, and they have to throw the entire recycling truck full of recyclables into the general waste because it's contaminated. And so that's in fact, it means that this sort of greenwashing or making stuff look like it's recyclable is really having quite a negative impact beyond just the influencing on the propaganda.
And then that sort of promotes our overconsumption of plastic products. And then when that's disposed of, I mean, and it's not great. And in a lot of cases where it might be incinerated, which might seem better, if it's not done well, and it's very, very hard to do so well, even in a developed country, like it's incredibly hard to incinerate plastic well, because it releases a ton of PM, very fine PM, particulate matter, that is transferable by air, and can get into water, etc. And it's obviously not good for you because it comes from plastics, which are not organic. So I mean, there's a lot of problems with that, just being around in our air and being around in our water, the PM from incinerated plastic, and also microplastics, of course, that have just broken down from plastics. But then, yeah, I mean, you also have the problems of like when they incinerate the plastics, all the greenhouse gases that then arise from that. So like, there's problems everywhere with plastic. In the end, I think that sort of wraps up the sort of plastic companies, but it's very similar to the oil companies in the fact that, again, they are constantly finding ways to like lobby and finding ways to sort of get their fingernails sort of dug into our political systems so that they have control over our decisions, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to remember plastic is a petrochemical. It's made from oil. So, it's all sort of interlinked. Yeah, so now let's talk about the meat industry. And again, we've already sort of touched on some of these points before, but I think what the meat industry has that perhaps plastic and oil lack is that the public are generally on their side. People get so up in arms about meat and their right to eat meat and all that sort of stuff. And, they're all, so many people get so angry at vegans, for example. It's really quite crazy. And the meat industry must just be loving that sort of positive media attention that they get and the sort of positive rap that they get because people love the taste of the products, which is slightly different in a way to oil, which people are, if it works out like financially, people are more than happy to drive an electric car. I think there are very few people who are super, super attached to the sound of the petrol engine or something like that. And especially stuff like power generation. People don't really care where that comes from. So meat industry is much more present in people's minds in terms of what the opinion is on it. And by creating a massive public divide and massive public debate, that just creates more publicity. All publicity is good publicity, perhaps debatable, but it's sort of undeniable that by being in the public conscience a lot, it makes people think about it in what's probably a positive way. They also, in their advertising, so almost not propaganda, just actual advertising when they're trying to sell you their products, they use so many false images, I think. Stuff like green fields is a very common image, or cows, roaming the mountains of Austria, when really it's totally false, and it's just a trick to try and lull you into false insecurity about what you're buying, as well as making false promises. Something that happens quite often is even statistics like about how it's carbon neutral or that sort of thing that are just false because they haven't been checked, or even when someone does check them, Advertising Standards Agency won't enforce it or something like that because of the lobbying, or goes back to lobbying, as well as buzzwords. So if it says farm fresh on it, anyone can put that. It doesn't mean anything. really. And there's lots of little tricks like that they can use to influence you. So probably somewhere on the line between propaganda and advertising.
Yeah, I think it was the EU actually that was recently trying to implement some sort of some policy that sort of aim to do away with greenwashing as a whole. But then you have this sort of issue with, and this is something that they encountered, and that I don't think that they found a way to sort of resolve, is that like there's not really a way to enforce to sort of actively enforce the laws that they establish on greenwashing, because there's like, where's the line? You know, where do you draw the line? Is it okay, like if Coke's saying, you know, we recycle 10% and they're giving false hope to the consumers, is that okay because they actually are improving? Or is that not okay? Or does it make it okay if then all of a sudden they're 25% or 50% recycling? Like, where is that line drawn? And that's a problem that they've sort of encountered. But it is a very sort of progressive concept that they're trying to find a way to enforce. And it's a great idea. Like, if the EU could find a way to do that, I mean, that would be a great stepping stone towards definitely more positive. I don't like the word positive, but a better future, because it sort of limits this fake idea that it's on you to, I mean, it is sort of on you, but that it's entirely on you to sort of control your consumption, and that to sort of remove that false sense of hope. That, I mean, obviously we need some hope, but not that we shouldn't feel good after buying something that says it has 10% recycled plastic, right?
Yeah, another thing that just drives me mad is the whole debate about calling plant milks milk. That I think currently in the EU it is illegal to call plant milks milk, and in the US they're considering changing it, but it really boggles my mind. It really sort of lays the propaganda bare that the meat companies and the dairy companies want it not to be allowed to call milk, because they think that having the word milk reserved for them is part of their propaganda and part of influencing people. And it's really strange if you give any thought to it, because of course it's milk. If you call it, everyone calls it oat milk. Like in regular conversation, no one says, "Oh, I'm going to go put some oat drink on my porridge." No one says that. Everyone calls it milk.
I bought like a box of oat milk. I'll say oat milk, but it was labeled as oat beverage, refreshing oat beverage or something. I was like, that, like, come on. Like,
I think in the US you can call it milk. I think in the US it can call milk. In Australia you can call it milk currently, but and same things like calling it a sausage or calling it a burger. Like, even if you look at the dictionary definition, not all dictionaries will list coming from a mammal, you know, the breast of a mammal, as being a requirement for being a milk, because it's an ancient tradition in places like China, for example. Soy milk, it's very old, and you know there's evidence of almond milk from thousands of years ago in Europe as being a popular thing. Dairy milk is only a few thousand years old, really, or a few 100,000 years old, which is minuscule compared to how long Homo sapiens has been roaming the earth. So it's just stupid, and it's just crazy, and it really shows how desperate these dairy companies are to have their propaganda and to have their public opinion. Same with meat companies. And lovely segue, this is all sort of enforced by the media, which often doesn't necessarily take the side of the planet or the consumer, and loves to push sensationalist stories. But another issue that the media have is supporting fossil fuel advertisements. So lots of people see lots of advertisements in the media, in the magazines, newspapers, online. And, you know, if we think about a comparison with tobacco, which is sort of the predecessor to oil in being uber evil mega companies, oil and tobacco, these organizations, these enterprises, conglomerates, the industry pioneered the idea that if you buy a full page ad in a newspaper or a magazine, that then instead of like saying buy oil now, you could write it and make it, format it to look like an article in the newspaper. So it's sort of, it's like a false, you know, newspapers have editorial integrity, and you sort of bypassing that by buying an ad and then making it look like it's just another page of the newspaper. Even if it doesn't look exactly the same, people still read it and they give it that sort of credence because it's in a newspaper that they trust. Modern news companies, online news companies, the New York Times, for example, has like a brand studio, and it's sort of it's supposedly separate from the editorial department, but basically a brand doesn't even have to write the news, inverted commas, themselves. They just pay the New York Times, a different division of the New York Times, to write the crazy pro-oil article for them and then publish it. They do the same for lots of different brands that are looking to improve their public image. The issue is that most news outlets don't have policies against fossil fuel ads. News companies were very quick to ban tobacco ads. Tobacco ads are now pretty much illegal everywhere across all media, but news companies banned them before they were illegal everywhere, before that was an issue, because they were thinking, well, we don't want to promote this because it's a bad thing, it's impacting people's health. Now, we're having the same thing with fossil fuels, except even though I don't think any news company is entirely supported by advertising from fossil fuels, there are lots of diverse sources of advertising, they're still allowing this misinformation. No, it's disinformation, right? Because it's deliberate. This disinformation, this propaganda, these lies that are ultimately impacting people's health. Air pollution, for example, massive cause of cancer. So it's really ridiculous that most news outlets haven't banned these, don't have an internal policy against it. It's crazy. All these sort of things that we've talked about, whether that be changing the news or advertising or utilizing the media or packaging, there's so many different ways that oil companies, plastic companies, meat companies, all these industries are using propaganda to fool us, and it's everywhere you look, and there's just so much volume that it's difficult to ignore, and it becomes a part of your mind, and that's a real issue. You're listening to Fighting Failure. This is episode 42, all about propaganda and how Big Oil uses it to subliminally influence you. If you like what we do, the best thing you can do is tell someone else about the show. We also have a Patreon link below. Now, let's move on to the solutions.
So our first solution here is, and the biggest thing that you can do as a citizen, as a consumer, is be aware, and practice that, so sort of get into that habit of mentally debunking the advertisement that you see and the propaganda that you're exposed to. So it's sort of, I mean, it can be hard, but it's getting out of that mindset where we think that buying something with 10% recycled plastic is better than not. It is better. It's not to say that you shouldn't do that, but it's the sort of idea that you doing that negates sort of more more negative consumption that you can have, right? So it's getting out of that mindset and being aware of the fact that you're constantly being exposed to media that sort of aims to manipulate you. So it's sort of just being aware of that, right?
If you're aware of it, and if you look at an oil advertisement and instead of just like looking at it and then glancing away, you could instead, it's a bit funny, but you could say, like, in your mind, you could explain to yourself, why that's dumb, why it's wrong, and how it's trying to trick you. Because they're playing mind games, and so you just have to be mentally strong, and you can fight them off easily. They're preying on the fact that you just see tons of stuff everywhere, and you don't pay particular attention to it. Really, that's what they're sort of preying off. So if you can fight against that, then, they can't do anything, really.
Yeah, and it's also about being aware of how your consumption, and I know this is sort of going into now consumption, not as much propaganda on the political side, but your consumption, right? Being aware of the fact that composite materials can't be recycled, like just being aware of how what you do, like what to do with that, right? So if you buy a plastic bottle, what to do with that? If you're buying a carton, what do you do with that? It's like, it's instead of assuming that things are recyclable because they look that way, question. And it's the same thing, you know, if a site looks like it's environmentally sustainable, or like it's promoting an environmentally sustainable sort of ideal, question that, look into it, read what they've put there. I mean, and there's ways that you can make yourself aware of this.
Think about why they've done it, because if it's a non-profit, then maybe if their goal is to help the climate, then they probably are. Or if it's a company that was set up with the express purpose of having some sort of pro-climate goal, then sure. But if it's Apple, then you think, why are they writing this stuff? Why have they got this marketing on their website? The reason is because what's the reason? Because they're trying to influence you and they're trying to sell more product. Similarly, sort of balance this out by, if you can find like pro-climate newsletters, unfiltered pro-climate news, there are surely sites out there, you know, like us, you can subscribe like on a podcast app or something. Then you can get the sort of other side, the good side of the news that isn't trying to manipulate you into buying more oil or something like that. Always make good choices, just generally thinking about climate. What choices can you make that are better, but at the same time, you know, it's about climate shadow, not carbon footprint. Listen to that episode. Support newspapers that don't allow fossil fuel ads. I think The Guardian doesn't allow fossil fuel ads.
I'm not sure, but I mean, you can do your research, and also if there is something that you don't feel that you agree with, that's not sort of, that you don't align with, that's in one of your news sources, you can write to them and question that, or you can just simply stop using it. You know, I mean,
a lot of good newspapers have a letters section where they will publish dissenting opinions, and that's a sign of good newspaper, is that they're willing to publish opposing viewpoints. You know, support pro-climate propaganda. You know, like petitions, share petitions, messages on social media that are supporting the environment, then help those rather than just, you know, seeing them go by. And similarly, be involved, call out greenwashing, call out when companies are doing this sort of stuff, say a social media post.
And your government. I mean, your government, right? It's supposed to be,
your government is beholden to
modern
you.
day. It's supposed to be, you know, by the people, for the people, right? It's supposed to be, the government is supposed to represent you and your opinion. So I mean, so you should matter to the government, and if you don't, that's a problem. So you should be open to addressing the government on that matter. Your local government, your executive government. I mean, there's different levels to which you can take that, but there's effects that you can have on all different levels. I mean, your voice does matter, and if you talk to other people about this and share this, share what you just learned, and make other people aware of greenwashing and propaganda and how to avoid that will make a difference, and then you get more people ready to make a change.
I think that's all we have to say. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Yep, see you next time. Not next week.
Not next week, next month. We're on a monthly cadence now, because we're busy people. Fighting Fairly was written this month by Oscar Archibald. Your host this week was Oscar Archibald, and your co-host was Hisham Kanaan. Produced by Oscar Archibald. FightingFairly.earth. See you next month.
See you guys. Thank you.
Excellent. That was way better than I was expecting it to be.